Karl Marx is said to be the very embodiment of communism, as if without his existence it wouldn't have come about. But who is Marx? Why has he got an ism after his name? What is Marxism, and who created it? Was it down to the efforts of Marx himself or the people around him? Something to really take into account was that people with his ideas existed before him, during him, and after him, which meant that all he was a competing factor in a time when internationalism was becoming very popular, when it was being pushed into Europe and beyond, and finding itself banned all over, but found itself a home here in London. And people like Engels came to lend a hand. So once more, I return to the question, what is Marxism? And is its existence because of the efforts of Marx himself, or the creativity and necessity of others? Marx had already visited England alongside Engels in Manchester at his family factory. Whilst in Manchester and running this factory, Engels decided to write a book called The Condition of the Working Class in England. The very hatred that spewed against the bourgeoisie, factory owner, or the greedy capitalist was instead turned into a sympathy affair for Engels, who spoke of his anguish in watching the suffering of his father's workers. The plight of his feelings seems to overshadow the actions of his father and the actual suffering of the individuals involved. This highlights the left-leaning opinions who'd have us believe everything else is evil for practicing capitalism, except people like Engels, all because he said so.
The bourgeoisie has gained a monopoly of all means of existence in the broadest sense of the word. What the proletarian needs, he can obtain only from this bourgeoisie, which is protected in its monopoly by the powers of the state. The proletarian is, therefore, in law and in fact, the slave of the bourgeoisie, which can decree his life or death.
By moving to work for his family's factory in Salford in Manchester, he was able to fund projects such as Capital, which, while funded by capitalist success, would, in its literature, critique the political economy of capitalism. Its fruit is the exploitation of labour. The very same exploited labour in which Engels worked to maintain would allow Marx to benefit from its fruits. This is how Engels is said to have been able to completely fund a new life for Marx in a nicer home and nicer locations. He housed the Marx family in a location in Grafton Terrace, 9 Grafton Terrace in Hampstead Heath, London, a very expensive area to which Eleanor is said to have named the small house, and which the family was said to have loved. Friedrich Engels met Marx in a cafe in France, where he saw enough in this downtrodden-looking character to invest into his future and legacy as if it were his own, all the while claiming to be too modest to front a movement the size of the one he helped create under Marx. Though he himself did, by proxy, gain a huge amount of fame and has himself been featured in all from propaganda posters of China to hanging portraits in London. These thoughts may have even been handed down as opposed to merely shared with the eccentric character to have an ism after his name and to who the world of communism attributes so very much. Engels already had his own views, having been converted to communism whilst attending his university in Germany, having been influenced by names already such as George Wilhelm and Friedrich Hegel. It was Engels who funded Karl Marx's Capital and who kept his head above water as they rose the ranks of London's socialist community, living in various locations and enjoying many a tea and alehouse. Engels would send money via postal orders to Marx in order to keep him above ground. The Marx family would ask or be sent money in the form of £1 or £5 at a time, and it's said that Engels would cut up the notes and send them separately.
Dear Engels, I have been seriously indisposed, for the perfidious Prussians have not permitted me either to stand, sit, or lie down. Hence my long silence and my failure so much as to acknowledge the money. A week ago I reached the pleasant point I no longer wanted to go out. For want of coats I have in pawn, and can no longer eat meat in want of credit. Piffling though it may be, I'm worried it may blow up into a scandal.
Engels was a huge supporter of Chartists, or Chartism, which was an alleged working class movement between 1830s and 1850s, the late 1850s, who'd been protesting across Britain and even caused an insurrection in Wales known as Newport Rising in the year 1839. It said Heinrich Marx, Karl's father, was heavily involved in his education and maintained a good relationship with him, as well as offering financial support all the way up until his death. Karl had been born in the year 1818 in Trier, Germany, and had been converted to Protestantism by his father at a young age, and had found great inspiration from some less known radicals which came before him. Marx's influence derived from names such as G.W.F. Hegel, who'd been shown to him by his radical lecturer at university, a man whom he held in high regard named Bauer. The thing that Marx is said to have taken away from Bauer was the notion that an idea or an object could not exist if it was separated from its opposite, and that for all to be fair, all must be made equal. This is in order for the same opposites not to harm each other. He'd also been influenced by characters such as Moses Hess, a radical socialist who introduced Marx to socialist meetings, where he'd learned the tricks of the trade of grassroots activism and radical activities. Whilst in Trier, Germany, he'd become engaged to fellow activist and theatre critic Johanna Bertha Julie Jenny Eld von Westphalen. Johanna was the daughter of the liberal Prussian civil servant Ludwig von Westphalen, son of Philip von Westphalen. Philip von Westphalen was the Prince of Braunschweig-Wolfenbüttel-Bevern, and from 1735 the Prince of Braunschweig-Wolfenbüttel was one of the closest confidants of Duke Ferdinand of Braunschweig. In Germany, Johanna's family were considered petty nobility, which meant they had a higher status in society and enjoyed privileges recognised by all from royalty to the lower orders of society. It said Johanna sacrificed her humility for the sake of living with Karl Marx, who we are led to believe had her living in squalor and misery. Johanna's family influence was incredibly powerful. It said her brother Edgar von Westphalen, the communist politician and writer, was a school friend of Karl Marx before he became his brother-in-law. Over the years, Marx had become banned from multiple countries.
He was banned from France in 1845 alongside his periodical thwarts. He'd also been banned from Belgium in 1848 under the accusation of arming workers, and then from Prussia in May 1849 whilst running the paper Nur Reinschzeitung.
Finally, Karl's luck ran out and he received his final exile. So he thought it was time to head to his favourite country, England, to London. Upon doing so, he found himself evicted from a couple of locations, such as in Chelsea, and found himself heading over to Soho, somewhere which he was familiar with and loved. Behind me is the building in which he headed to, known as, at the time, the German Hotel. It was called the German Hotel because it housed Germans who had been banned from Germany for breaking national laws. But not only Germans, it would facilitate anyone who had the same political viewpoint as Marx and his colleagues. Now, like most other things in Marx's life, this went, to be technical, it went pear-shaped. He ticked or borrowed money with no intention of paying it back and was evicted from here, allegedly. Allegedly, his wife came down for breakfast one morning and they refused to serve her and said, "Pack up, it's time to leave." To which he found himself moving not far from this location. But at the time, it said that there was much fuss made over the eviction of Marx and his family. Apparently it was a harrowing, upsetting scene, but we'll have to take the storyteller's words for it. But this was the building in question, which was housing foreign emigres which had made themselves unwelcome in the countries in which they were previously resident. And here it is today, looking very much the same as it was all that time ago. After his short stint in various hotels, Karl and his entire family moved into this property behind me, 28 Dean Street. You can see just there a plaque dedicated to Karl Marx, though allegedly the dates are wrong on the plaque itself. Now, interestingly, he didn't just move here with his family, but his maid came with him. A man who was stricken with poverty still somehow had a maid, and some accounts tell us that this maid worked for free. How good of her. But other accounts also tell of a huge case of adultery and a child out of wedlock between the maid and Karl. Obviously, who knows what the truth is. But the rumours are that Engels had to take parentage of the child in order to alleviate some of the shame, shall we say. If you was to believe history's accounts, you'd believe that Karl, his wife, his horde of children and his maid lived in 2 tiny rooms at the top of this building in absolute squalor. There are written accounts of this. I have one here I'm going to read to you. This account was written by Paul Johnson, the English-born journalist, historian and author, noted in his book Intellectuals in 1988. Quote, "In all his researches into the inequalities of British capitalism, he came across many instances of low-paid workers, but he never succeeded in unearthing one who was paid literally no wages at all. Yet such a worker did exist in his own household. This was Helen Demuth, the lifelong family maid. She got her keep, but was paid nothing. She was a ferociously hard worker, not only cleaning and scrubbing, but managing the family budget. Marx never paid her a penny." So she's dealing with the family finances and not getting any of it. In 1845 to 50, Helen became Marx's mistress and conceived a child. Marx refused to acknowledge his responsibility then or ever and flatly denied the rumours that he was the father. The son was put out to be fostered by a working class family called Lewis, but allowed to visit the Marx household to see his mother. He was, however, forbidden to use the front door and obliged to see his mother only in the kitchen. Marx was terrified that the boy's paternity would be discovered and that this would do him fatal damage as a revolutionary leader and seer. Marx persuaded Engels to acknowledge the boy privately as a cover story for family consumption, but Engels was not willing to take the secret to the grave. Engels died of cancer of the throat on the 5th of August 1895, unable to speak but unwilling that Eleanor, one of Marx's daughter, should continue to think of her father unsullied. He wrote on a slate, "Freddie." The boy's name is Mark's son. End quote. As well as adultery and neglect, Marx was noted to have been lazy and unable to maintain basic standards of sanitation, with some finding him badly kept and an unattractive figure to look at. One account of this was a record made by a Prussian police officer tasked with gathering information from Marx while he was in London. The spy entered Marx's home in London under the cover of a German revolutionary. His account was later shared to the British ambassador in Berlin. This is a section of that report.
Marx leads the existence of a bohemian intellectual. Washing, grooming, and changing his linen are things he does rarely, and he is often drunk. Though he is frequently idle for days on end, he will work day and night, with tireless endurance when he has much work to do. He has no fixed time for going to sleep or waking up. He often stays up all night and then lies down, fully clothed on the sofa at midday, and sleeps till evening, untroubled by the whole world coming or going through his room. There is not one clean and solid piece of furniture. Everything is broken, tattered, and torn, with half an inch of dust over everything and the greatest disorder everywhere. When you enter Marx's room, smoke and tobacco fumes make your eyes water. Everything is dirty and covered with dust, so that to sit down becomes a hazardous business. Here is a chair with 3 legs. On another chair the children are playing cooking. This chair happens to have 4 legs. This is the one that is offered to the visitor, but the children's cooking has not been wiped away, and if you sit down, you risk a pair of trousers.
The family affair was certainly a strange one, with unclear motives to this day. What is and is not true we cannot be sure of, but for a man with an expensive smoking and drinking habit, the poverty that his family is said to have been through would highlight either the lack of care from Marx for his wife and children, or that historians have lied on his behalf to give credit to his communist rantings. Either way, it's not a good look. Whilst at Dean Street, Marx is said to have had his hardest time of all, living in utter poverty, but still managing to get himself banned from public houses. One line of work was to write articles for the New York Tribune, to which he'd be paid £1 per article, but is said to have been helped in completing said articles by Engels, due to him being unable to write 2 a week consistently. At Dean Street, Karl Marx lost 3 of his children, from what we're led to believe were diseases brought about by poverty. During the years that Marx and his family lived at Dean Street, he wasn't out looking for work. During the time that his family was said to be at their most povertous, when his children were dying, he was frequenting this location, the British Museum, a place where he would prepare notes for what would become Kapital, obviously before it became Das Kapital, via the help of Engels. It's where he would meet many a like-minded individual. Strangely enough, this establishment actually gave him a free entry pass. Why? You'll have to tell me. But this is where Karl Marx spent every single day during the years of his family's hardest times. And we are led to believe that he was deeply troubled by their pain and anguish, yet instead of going out of his way to help it, he was here. Not all of Marx's children died. At least one that he acknowledges, outlived him, and that was Eleanor Marx. I've told her story in the past in a documentary called Bloody Sunday, where I spoke about her relationship with Edward Aveling and her alleged early suicide, where she was a troubled lover and found that Edward Aveling had been cheating on her and planned to marry elsewhere. But Eleanor Marx continued her father's work and had more of a physical effect on London post Marx's death than Marx did during his life. She led marches for the dockers and tailors and so on. She led huge marches that turned into unions. For instance, Will Thorne, she taught him to read and write. Will Thorne founded the GMB, which is the largest union, alleged largest union in Britain. Now, very little is told about Eleanor Marx, but she is still idolized heavily by modern feminists. And there's this contention in the left of blame that's given towards Edward Aveling for her early death, as she allegedly sent for some poison via one of her maids and received it under the signature of Edward Aveling. So there is some contention as to whether she did commit suicide or there was some foul play there. Either way, she's still a huge name which has been heavily overlooked post the death of Marx, not by fanatical leftists or radicals. They're fully aware of who she is. Now, interestingly, Eleanor, which is all explained in the documentary Bloody Sunday, which is about a riot in the year 1887 concerning the Socialist Democratic Federation, which she was a part of post the death of Marx. And this was a Marxist party set up by Henry Heinemann. It also had the likes of William Morris in its ranks, who would later go on to form their own groups alongside the likes of Eleanor. But needless to say, in the first few years after Marx dying, Eleanor's very name was incredibly influential. It was influential enough for her to just be invited to places purely because of who her father was. And let's really point out that Marxism during Marx's life wasn't that big a deal. Obviously, it was turning into communism. There was people competing with Marx, like Bakunin. So once Marx had finally died like many people, that's when Marxism truly became a massive thing. Not just in London, but around the world. We would also be led to believe that Marx was an incredibly downtrodden character, povertous character, who'd come from the school of hard knocks. Fact is, he'd been banned from multiple countries by the time he found himself in London full time. And his family name actually carried far more weight than people would have you believe. You see, the grandfather of Karl Marx was in fact the rabbi of Trier. His father was a successful solicitor. Now, we hear of Engels. We hear of Engels financially backing Marx. There's many examples of this, which is also very funny considering he was such a wealthy capitalist, a factory owner. He owned factories in Manchester and abroad. His family were well known for it. So that's the complete polar opposite to the ethos we're led to believe Karl Marx created. But even more interesting than Engels, the Philips family, who today you know as Philips Electronics. But in the times of Marx and before, this family were making their money in the tobacco trade. Now, the tobacco trade, like that of sugar and tea, was predominantly run throughout plantations and slave trades and so on. So once again, we find ourselves in the situation of, did Marx really represent the poor, the working class, the downtrodden? Or was he actually more financially backed, more financially stable than the stories in which we're told? If you listen to people lecture or speak about Marx today, they'll speak about Engels and his financing till they're blue in the face. But you will not hear them, or very rarely will you hear them mention the Phillips family, whose family line seems to be very difficult to find, and Google even claims that it's gone missing. So we're left with this question of, was Marx really as poor as we're led to believe? And if he wasn't as poor as we're led to believe, how did the stories we're told end up happening at all? Now, if we was to be suspicious, and how can I know for sure? How can any of us know for sure? But if I was to be suspicious, I would think that the transatlantic slave trades assisted the people that assisted Marx. For instance, in Germany, the factory that belonged to Engels, which was a cotton factory, has since become a museum to him and his family legacy, much like the Philips, which put money in the pockets of Karl and his wife, who were dealing in tobacco. So obviously, where the history is so difficult to find exactly, it would be unfair of me to say that these people were definitely involved in the transatlantic slave trade, but I find it difficult to find where they would have made such incredible wealth without it. Karl Marx's mother, Henrietta Pressburg, also came from a successful family line, as the daughter of a textile merchant named Isaac Pressburg and the granddaughter of a rabbi in the Netherlands. Henrietta's sister, Sophie Pressburg, would go on to marry the wealthy tobacco merchant Lion Phillips. This is the White Hart pub. Wonderful old building, like many of the buildings around here. Stunning, worth keeping, but it holds a secret, just like many of the other buildings around here. This is 191 Drury Lane. It was used by the Communist League as a front during the years of their reign and early setup. What it really was a place for foreign emigres that had been banned for many crimes, and international socialists to gather. One story tells us of a police officer who had broken in order to listen in on the meeting and hid in a cupboard, but the meeting was in German, so he had to stay silent throughout the whole meeting. But the Communist League in fact used it as a meeting point because they understood that Europe did not want anarcho-communism, anarchism, however you want to put extreme leftists, whatever you want to name it, it wasn't wanted. So because of its illegalities, they needed to hide their true intentions in properties just like this, which you'd find all around areas just like this. Together, Marx and Engels helped to establish something called the Internationale, or the Working Men's Association. This was known as the First Internationale. The headquarters was set up here at 18 Greek Street in Soho, which is directly behind me. The original meeting occurred at St Martin's Hall in London in 1864, and this meeting would go on to influence and guide the actions of future communist revolutionaries, and was made up of a list of international socialists who'd converged under one spot in order to form one organisation. This would see a large group of people from all over Europe attend, such as the Owenites, who were followers of the belief system of Robert Owen, who was a wealthy textile manufacturer. He was a founder of utopian socialism and the cooperative movement during the early 18th century. Another factory owner who had decided to move abroad with his socialist values, Owen had used his wealth to establish an experimental socialist community at New Harmony, Indiana, in an effort to create his utopian ideals, which failed within a few years of its starting. Followers of Louis Auguste Blanqui, a French socialist and political activist, had come to attend, who would have travelled in from France, as did followers of a man named Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, another outspoken socialist from France. These groups had many differences, with some rejecting communism and others having no respect for ideas like socialist anarchism. Tensions eventually took shape in the form of two faces of the Internationale becoming opposing figureheads of leadership, which were Karl Marx and a man named Mikhail Bakunin. Bakunin was the founder of collectivist anarchism, and he and his followers had motives best described in the name of Peter Kropotkin. Quote, direct economical struggle against capitalism without interfering in the political parliamentary agitation, while Marx had become interested in parliamentary proceedings and parliamentary gains.
Bakunin, of course, disagreed. He said that any state, even a worker state, if it had army, police, prisons, will become a tyranny. Bakunin loved to argue with me.
This saw Bakunin expelled from the Internationale, with Marx claiming him to be within a secret organisation within the group with bad intent. This must have bothered Bakunin heavily, because he decided to start his own Internationale, if you like, named the Anti-Authoritarian Internationale in 1872, a clear dig at Marx, if you want to see it that way. Engels went on to act as the Internationale's correspondence secretary for Belgium, Italy, Denmark, Portugal, and Spain, spreading the influence of himself and Marx across Europe, forever building the legacy of Marxism, when in reality, much of its existence was actually down to Friedrich Engels. So, in this stunning, beautiful area, Marx and Engels would enjoy plenty of beverage together, plenty of leisure time. Behind me was one of the tea houses, known as a Marx tea house, a stunning building which I can think of many a wonderful name which do not have plaques and buildings after them, or anything to remind us of them and their legacy. Whilst the stunning buildings of London may look beautiful from the outside, but some of them hide darker stories within their walls. So what is Marxism? Marx didn't complete all of his works. Marxism is described as many various things and was left open to interpretation by the followers of Marx literature. You see, ultimately, Marxism is what leads to communism. The ideas of Marxism eventually created communism. Marxism, to most people, is a representation of what they believe communism is, which is gaining the means of production for the working class or for poorer people. But in today's time, most people that adopt Marxism or try to explain it are usually using it as an internationalist or communist slogan more so than actually breaking it down and explaining it. Because you'll find that when you do look for definitions, quite often they vary and they refer to the ideas, socio-economic and decisions of Marx, not a summarization. And when you watch different people, they will sometimes give you different ideas as to what Marxism is. And many people attribute the anti-theist, the anti-religious sentiment to Marx. But Marxism is the discussion on all of those things, and communism was what Marx believed was the solution to the problems that Marxism discussed. And this is the fundamental difference between Marxism and communism. Communism is written in stone, it's very basic what it says and what it means. Marxism is open to all kinds of interpretation. We stand now at what would be an iconic location for any communist or admirer of Marx, because this building here behind me is the location where the Communist Manifesto was announced. This is what was known as the Red Lion pub on Windmill Street. This document, the Communist Manifesto, would spread to many countries, would begin here, in the safe haven for foreign emigres, London. London was a place to work in safety, while many others in their own nations fought to keep communism and its figureheads at bay. The height of Engels and Marx authorship was the creation of what's known as the Communist Manifesto on the 29th of November in 1847, which was an agreed upon idea at the Red Lion pub behind me here, Windmill Street. At the time, it was the German Workers' Association who were holding their second conference for the Communist League. Engels and Marx allegedly proposed the writing of the manifesto, but angered those in the meeting when they failed to produce the document by the designated time. Other accounts say that they were given the task of writing the manifesto. Either way, they would have to wait until 1848 until its final release. Now, what makes the Communist Manifesto so special is until this point, until this document was agreed upon and finally published, there was no actual written rules for the various, whether you want to call them anarchist communists or just regular communists. There was no set of rules. Now, every group and faction around the world had their own Bible. And this Bible of communism is what went forward into the world as we know it and created the history of communism that you know today. The very first sentences in the Communist Manifesto give us a clear idea just how determined its creators were to thwart the national and individual identity of the nations in which it targeted.
The spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this spectre. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies. Where is the party in opposition that has not been decried as communistic by its opponents in power? Where is the opposition that has not hurled back the branding reproach of communism against the more advanced opposition parties, as well as against its reactionary adversaries? To this end, communists of various nationalities have assembled in London and sketched the following manifesto.
So let me now read you a few more examples which might help highlight just what it was that the governments and individuals of these nations wanted to repel when it came to communism or the ideas that were leading up to communism. And these quotes here can be found in Chapter 2 of the Communist Manifesto. I'll try and read them as quickly as I can. And the abolition of the state of things is called by the bourgeois, or bourgeoisie, abolition of individuality and freedom, and rightly so. The abolition of bourgeois individuality, bourgeois independence, and bourgeois freedom is undoubtedly aimed at. Next quote. You are horrified at our intending to do away with private property. But in your existing society, private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population. Its existence for the few is solely due to its non-existence in the hands of those 9/10. You reproach us, therefore, with intending to do away with a form of property, the necessary condition for whose existence is the non-existence of any property for the immense majority of society. In one word, you reproach us with intending to do away with your property. Precisely so. That is just what we intend. And my last example here, as I said, these are all found in Chapter 2 of the Communist Manifesto. Abolition of the family. Even the most radical flare-up at this infamous proposal of the communists. On what foundation is the present family, the bourgeois family, based on? On capital, on private gain. It is completely developed from this family. Exists only among the bourgeoisie, but this state of things finds its complement in the practical absence of the family among the proletarians, and in public prostitution. The bourgeois family will vanish as a matter of course when its complement vanishes, and both will vanish with the vanishing of capital. In Marx's final years of life, he travelled to Algiers and lived a life of leisure, but was crushed by the death of his wife and his daughter Jenny, thus ending his political activities. Eventually, Marx died on the 14th of March in 1883 here in London by what some describe as a lung abscess. Friedrich Engels is said to have discovered the body whilst conducting one of his daily visits. The funeral of the famous Karl Marx was believed to have had as little as 20 people in attendance, where speeches were given in Russian and German. We return to the notion that Engels had helped to create the legacy of Karl by looking at his speech at the graveside, which really speaks volumes, where he speaks of the legacy that he wishes to be left behind for Marx.
On the 14th of March, at 2:45 in the afternoon, the greatest living thinker ceased to exist. He had been left alone for scarcely 2 minutes, and when we came back we found him in his armchair, peacefully gone to sleep, but forever, an immeasurable loss has been sustained both by the militant proletariat of Europe and America and by historical science in the death of this man. The gap that has been left by the departure of this mighty spirit will soon enough make itself felt. Just as Darwin discovered the law of development of organic nature, so Marx discovered the law of development of human history, the simple fact, hitherto concealed by an overgrowth of ideology, that mankind must first of all eat, drink, have shelter and clothing, before it can pursue politics, science, art, religion, etc. That therefore the production of the immediate material means of subsistence, and consequently the degree of economic development attained by a given people or during a given epoch, form the foundation upon which the state, institutions, the legal conceptions, art, and even the ideas on religion of the people concerned have been evolved, and in the light of which they must, therefore, be explained, instead of vice versa, as had hitherto been the case. But that is not all. Marx also discovered the special law of motion governing the present-day capitalist mode of production and the bourgeois society that this mode of production has created. The discovery of surplus value suddenly threw light on the problem in trying to solve, which all previous investigations of both bourgeois economists and socialist critics had been groping in the dark. 2 such discoveries would be enough for one lifetime. Happy the man to whom it is granted to make even one such discovery. But in every single field which Marx investigated, and he investigated very many fields, none of them superficially, in every field, even in that of mathematics, he made independent discoveries. Such was the man of science. But this was not even half the man. Science was for Marx a historically dynamic, revolutionary force. However great the joy with which he welcomed a new discovery in theoretical science, whose practical application perhaps it was, as yet, quite impossible to envisage, he experienced quite another kind of joy when the discovery involved immediate revolutionary changes in industry and in historical development in general. For example, he followed closely the development of the discoveries made in the field of electricity, and recently, those of Marcel Dupré. For Marx was before all else a revolutionist. His real mission in life was to contribute in one way or another to the overthrow of capitalist society and of the state institutions which it had brought into being, to contribute to the liberation of the modern proletariat, which he was the first to make conscious of its own position and its needs, conscious of the conditions of its emancipation. Fighting was his element, and he fought with a passion, a tenacity, and a success such as few could rival. His work on the first Rheinische Zeitung, 1842, the Paris Vorwärts, 1844, Brüsseler Deutsche Zeitung, 1847, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, 1848-49, the New York Tribune, 1852-61, and in addition to these, a host of militant pamphlets, work in organizations in Paris, Brussels, and London, and finally, crowning all, the formation of the great International Working Men's Association. This was indeed an achievement of which its founder might well have been proud, even if he had done nothing else. And, consequently, Marx was the best hated and most calumniated man of his time. Governments, both absolutist and republican, deported him from their territories. Bourgeois, whether conservative or ultra-democratic, vied with one another in heaping slanders upon him. All this he brushed aside as though it were cobweb, ignoring it, answering only when extreme necessity compelled him. And he died beloved, revered, and mourned by millions of revolutionary fellow-workers, from the mines of Siberia to California, in all parts of Europe and America, and I make bold to say that though he may have had many opponents, he had hardly one personal enemy. His name will endure through the ages, and so also will his work. Der Sozialdemokrat, March 22nd, 1883.
So Highgate Cemetery has been split into 2 parts, East Wing and West Wing. behind me is the West Wing, which is also very interesting, but the East Wing doesn't just hold Marx. Something incredibly interesting about the East Wing is it's actually a place for many communist leaders to lay their head for all eternity. You see, beside Marx and all around Marx are numerous names that were involved in international socialism or communism. So many names, in fact, that it's almost as if this space or these spaces have been preserved and protected, especially the protected East Wing, especially for people who had been banned from other countries or had been held accountable for either leading communist parties or spying on foreign countries on behalf of a communist party. Something equally as interesting is the fact that to gain entry to the East Wing, the site where Karl Marx is buried, the man which is attributed the foundations of communism, will cost you over £10 for the privilege. Kids might get in a little bit cheaper, but needless to say, it's certainly is it an anti-climax or is it a climax for an anti-capitalist to allow capitalism to sort of dominate his fandom? People that want to come and see Karl Marx, the creator of communism, you'd better be prepared to pay for the privilege. Now, something that I find just as suspicious as the fact that Karl Marx is buried in a heavily expensive location, which is heavily protected, that you have to pay just to gain entry to, is the fact that he's buried around so many other huge communists. It doesn't look like an ordinary cemetery to me at all. Since the death of Marx and Engels, many mementos have been created in acts of remembrance. In Bloody Sunday, we covered the Marx Library in Clerkenwell Green, which once supplied an office to Lenin, which is preserved to this day. Engels' statue still sits proudly in Manchester, as well as across the world, usually accompanied by Marx. The two really do go hand in hand, yet we hear no mention of Engelism. Leninism, Trotskyism, and so on stem off the back of Marxism. So the mystery is, why did history forget Engels when creating these isms? So in the beginning, we asked the question, who is Marx? What is Marxism? And would Marxism have existed had it only been left to Karl Marx himself? Like many other projects that we've done, I'm going to make a similar point, that only you can decide, having looked at everything we've looked at, the truth behind his life, some of the more so hidden stories, only you can decide whether Marxism is a real thing or was a necessary tool, an image for internationalism, a logo for what some people would call terror.